Good morning, colleagues. I went through the name list, and Ian, I also saw that our Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Innovation, Professor Frans Waanders, is with us. I also noted the name of our Deputy Dean, Research in the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Myrna Nel, and to all the other colleagues, welcome to this webinar. And then a special word of welcome to Ian Golden, whom I will introduce to you. Now, on the 24th of December 2020, Antarctica reported their first 36 COVID-19 cases. And on that day, there was an announcement that the coronavirus has spread to all 7 continents. So the title of today's webinar, The COVID-19 Pandemic from Global Crisis to a Better World, is indeed befitting. There is a necessity to think about life after COVID and also to feel positive and hopeful about the future. The mission of Optentia is to develop and organize knowledge for the optimal expression of individual, social, and institutional potential. So this is very relevant to do this research together with these colleagues in this field. We also have our first council workshop next week, and the theme of the workshop is taking stock of the way in which the mitigation strategies have changed or shaped the business of the university in terms of sustaining or enhancing our core business, which confirms the need to make sense of the impact of this global pandemic. So it's now my privilege to introduce to you our speaker today, Ian Golding. Ian is a world expert in economics, finance, and global affairs, as well as innovation and social issues long warned of the dangers of pandemics in a globalized world. Currently, director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Technological and Economic Change at the University of Oxford, Ian is founding director of the Oxford Martin School, the world's leading center for interdisciplinary studies. This center focuses on finding solutions to the biggest global problems. From 1996 to 2001, he was chief executive of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and at the time also served as an advisor to President Nelson Mandela. From 2001 to 2006, Ian was vice president of the World Bank and the group's director of policy. He has published numerous articles and 22 books. His most recent is Rescue: From Global Crisis to a Better World. So, Professor Golden, we are delighted to have you with us this morning. And I want to leave you with the words of Shakespeare before I give you the floor. Now, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Brutus said, "There's a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea we are now afloat." And what brutally actually says is that as humans, we must be insightful enough to recognize opportunities granted by fate. So, Professor Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Dupuis. Thanks to you and to Jaco and Ian for inviting me to give this lecture. I'm delighted to be able to share some thoughts with you, your colleagues, students at Northwest University. The Shakespeare quote that you cite is indeed a timely one. And we need to seize this moment. The pandemic has been the worst thing that's happened in most of our lives, in our economies, and globally is the biggest setback, not least for the achievement of poverty reduction, for creating sustainable jobs, and in health. But if we see this as a wake-up call, if we use this moment to create a better world, all the suffering will not be in vain. When thinking about how we can use this time to create a better world, I like to draw on some historical examples. And what we see is that there's no preset outcome for these sorts of crises and what will happen next. One can look at the previous big pandemics. The biggest pandemic that's ever hit humanity was in 1918, we think, when up to 1/3 of the world's population was infected and died because of the pandemic at the time. Most people didn't even know the pandemic was happening. And it's only historically that we've been able to put it back together and see how many people were affected immediately after the First World War. But that was a very slow pandemic, and it was a slow information movement. It's called the Spanish flu, but in fact, it wasn't Spanish. It came from Texas. And the Spanish were saddled with the name because they were the first to admit and to recognize that they had it. And that shows the dangers of transparency then. But what we recognize from that is the total failure to even calculate the impact. And now is different because we understand what's happening. We have our science. And that gives us the first opportunity to do something about it and to stop it. We have that with climate change too. We never knew climate change was happening until about 25 years ago. It was highly unrecognized. And now we know the dramatic implications of it. And this awareness of what is happening, this awareness of what's happening around the world, the poverty, the suffering, the pandemics, climate change, gives us a new responsibility. Because out of our knowledge, we have the need to act. But not only do we have the knowledge to act, we know what to do and how to do it. And so the big question is this the pandemic to end all pandemics? Will this be the last pandemic? Or is this just one of many in a cycle? And if it is, we're in a very dangerous time. In 2014, I wrote a book called The Butterfly Defect: Why Globalization Creates Systemic Risks and What to Do About It. And the idea is that interconnected systems not only spread great things, great ideas, but also really bad ones too. And how we manage this, what many call globalization, is the key question. Globalization for me means flows over national borders of goods, of services, of ideas, of finance, of many things. Many people see it as a bad thing. Globalization has become a dirty word. But I believe this is a huge failure to understand the breadth of the dimensions of globalization. There would be no vaccines without globalization. There would be no global human rights movement. There would not have been the support for the anti-apartheid movement. There would not have been the investments in South Africa or the exports from South Africa, which South Africa desperately needs to generate income. There wouldn't be this webinar. There wouldn't be flows of knowledge. There wouldn't be flows of finance or trade or medicine or ideas like the Me Too movement, like the spread of gay rights around the world, of so many good progressive ideas of democracy and human rights, the learning we have from being in an interconnected world. But globalization also spreads bads, and we've seen, of course, in the pandemic, a very dramatic representation of this. There would be no global spread of pandemics if it wasn't for the airport hubs that spread good things too. And the super spreaders of the good things of globalization, like the cyber systems that allowed this webinar to happen, also spread cyber viruses and bad attacks and fake news. Like the financial centers that allow us to transfer money and invest, also spread global financial crises. Like airport hubs, which allow us to travel, also become the entry points and exit points for pandemics and very bad things. And it's not just that they're interconnected, it's also good things can lead to bad things. It's wonderful that so many people in South Africa are escaping energy poverty and getting electrification, and we want there to be more reliable and more electrification, so Eskom doesn't have power outages. But of course, more energy means more carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. More people that have cars is more gases, and that leads globally to escalating climate change. We want more people in the world to have access to antibiotics. That's a great thing. It prevents diseases saves lives. But if more people around the world take antibiotics, there'll be growing antibiotic resistance and none of them will be effective. We want more people in the world to have access to wider range of food. But if they continue to consume as they are, the oceans will be depleted of fish and we'll have catastrophic collapse of the Amazon as herds of animals and are used on savannas and the forests are burnt down. And so managing globalization and managing the success of our lives is absolutely critical. And that's going to become more so. But while everything is more and more connected, and we've seen that in so many dimensions of our lives, in travel, in finance, in studying, in the ideas we have, more and more things come from other places and flow to other places. South Africa is influencing the countries around it and the world through its actions, through its investments, through its trade, through its ideas. As more and more of this happens and we become more interconnected, there's one thing that's not connecting, and that's the politics. The world is more divided. And that gap between increased integration of ideas, of trade, of other dimensions, and a system of politics which is stuck in the 1800s of national politics, of divide and rule, of tensions, is what causes these problems. We can manage global pandemics. We can manage climate change. The world can overcome poverty. It can overcome malaria and critical diseases, but it needs to work together to do it. There's enough brain power. There's enough technological capacity. There's enough money, but it requires solidarity to achieve these ends. Solidarity within countries and solidarity between countries. And it's that failure, the growing individualism, which has led to where we are today. People thinking increasingly of I and me, not we or us. It's that disconnect which has atomized our countries, our societies, and the global system. Countries believing they can go it alone. The international organizations like the World Health Organization, which is responsible for managing global pandemics, being starved of resources, starved of political power, starved of the mandate, because countries believe they can do it alone. Climate change not being given enough attention. At the Paris Agreement, which was a major step forward of 2015 to stop the rise in greenhouse gas emissions, the rich countries committed to give $100 billion a year to developing countries to help them make this transition to renewable energy, to electrify without increasing use of dirty fuels like coal. But the money never came. After the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, countries came together and said they would better manage finance and give up some of their national powers to collective regulation, but it never happened. Indeed, what's happened is a growing Cold War between the US and China, which is poisoning global affairs. It makes it impossible for the UN to agree things. And far from this pandemic leading to more solidarity, we've seen a withdrawal, a growing nationalism. The rich countries have found $12 trillion, that's 12,000 billion dollars for themselves to support their firms, their workers. In the UK, people are paid not to go to work. Firms are paid to stop them going bankrupt. In fact, bankruptcies have gone down in the pandemic sharply in the rich countries, in the US, across Europe, Japan, etc. And in the US, poverty has actually gone down because so many people are getting stimulus checks from the government. $6 trillion of stimulus has been created. But while the rich countries have found this money for themselves, between 10 and 20% of the size of their GDPs, less than 1% has gone to developing countries, less than $100 billion. And the WHO, as you know, has not got the resources it needs. So we've seen growing tensions. And in order to ensure that this pandemic leads to a better world, we need to ensure between countries and within countries much greater solidarity. What the pandemic has done has given resources to those that have and taken from those that don't. People that can work remotely, and I include myself, and I think this is true of many academics as well, have not seen their incomes collapse, have not lost their jobs. But people that cannot work remotely have suffered terribly in lockdowns. And so the divide in society between people that are able and have the space at home, who have a room to work, who have internet, who don't have to be looking after their kids or their parents or grandparents or others, people who are able to work have done okay. But people who share a shack or a room with others who don't have internet, but aren't allowed to go to work, or have to go to work in crowded transport, or have to do essential work which is highly vulnerable to the pandemic, have suffered much higher death rates and also dramatic losses of income. And that's why we see around the world poverty has increased dramatically. 125 million people have been pushed into absolute poverty as a result of the pandemic. The idea of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, to eradicate poverty by 2030 seems like a distant dream now. It will not happen. It's been derailed by the pandemic. And so too many other ambitions to improve education outcomes, to improve many others. And of course, while resources have been concentrated on the pandemic, other critical needs, like dealing with tuberculosis, dealing with malaria, dealing with malnutrition, have suffered dramatically. So what we need to see from this pandemic is a recognition within our countries and between our countries of much greater solidarity. What does this mean in practice? I've been very interested by comparing the First and Second World Wars and what happened during them and after them. And as you know, they were two absolutely terrible wars. Over 20 million people were killed in the First World War, over 60 million people in the Second World War. During the First World War, many people said, including the famous writer H.G. Wells, this is the war to end all wars. We cannot go through this suffering again. And they created the League of Nations. And what happened next, of course, history recalls as the Roaring Twenties, the jazz age, celebration, and then the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, Nazism, and an even worse war. But that Second World War was very different. While the bombs were dropping in London on the buildings, while people around, including around Oxford, were building fortifications, which are still here, because they thought the country was going to be invaded by the Germans. They built a new world. The welfare state was created, as was the United Nations, as were the Bretton Woods institutions, the Marshall Plan. The real belief that the suffering could not be in vain. And that lesson from history, I believe, is the important one. Now, why was it that Churchill and Roosevelt and others were able to do this, despite fighting a war on 5 fronts? Why was the world prepared to agree this when it wasn't after the First World War? And the reason, I believe, is because they'd been through the First World War, because they recognized that history does repeat itself, that you have to do something radical to stop the track of history. And this goes back to Professor Duplessis' Shakespearean comment. When the tide turns, you surf or you sink. Mm. You've got to learn to take the wave when it's there. And if you don't, you get overwhelmed by it. And we're in that moment again in history. We're at a moment where things are so clear and so bad that unless we take these reforms now, we're unlikely to take them in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or 20 years' time. Indeed, we're likely to see escalating crises return because we haven't dealt with the fundamental underlying problems, whether it's pandemics or climate change or inequality and poverty within our societies. It's very interesting too to me, and I've been speaking a lot to the wonderful historian Margaret Macmillan about this. I did a BBC series called The Pandemic That Saved the World, where I interviewed her about this. I think it's available on the World Service website. Why do we just have to wait for the right leaders in order to make the changes that we want from society? Is it just up to leaders? Was the world just lucky to have Churchill and Roosevelt in control at that time that led to the UN and the welfare state and so on? Not only the welfare state in the UK, but in the US too. You know, tax rates were over 70%, and work was guaranteed in the US. What would be regarded now as socialist was absolutely central to Churchill and to Roosevelt's policies. But what history shows us is actually it wasn't just leaders, it was an absolute demand of the people. The soldiers returning from the war demanded that the world be different. And although Churchill was the real hero of the time, and everyone thinks about him as the Churchillian hero, he was actually voted out of office with a landslide. He was conservative, landslide, Labour victory 9 weeks after the war ended. And the reason was he wouldn't support the welfare state and the radical reforms. And a complete unknown, Clem Attlee, Labour Party leader, swept to power on the commitment of creating the welfare state and implementing the Beveridge Report and other reforms that had been promised. And what that teaches me is that, as it's said in South Africa, people get hurtful. They won't change. I'm originally from Pretoria, so you can take me to Oxford, but you can't take the Pretoria out of me. The people want change, and if leaders don't get it, then they're not going to stay in power. And that's the advantage of democracy, by the way, over autocracy. That autocrats can, but in democracies, people can speak. And that's what happened in Britain. The welfare state was created out of a popular revolution. Now, I see this happening in many places. Obviously, we've seen in the US, Trump being replaced by Biden. Now, I wouldn't call Biden a revolutionary, but I'm sure that he's unlikely to have won if it hadn't been for the pandemic. Of course, the fact that Trump got 74 million votes, 10 million more than in the previous election, is a very disturbing thing to me. But what it shows is this commitment to a new way of thinking about it and doing it, which needs to necessarily include more redistribution and higher taxes. The people that have done extremely well in this pandemic are the billionaires. The average income of the top 1,000 income earners in the world has gone up 25%. Jeff Bezos could give over $100,000 to all the workers that work for Amazon and would still be richer after the pandemic than before the pandemic, because Amazon has done fantastically well. And the same is true of Google, Zoom that we're using, and all these beneficiaries of the pandemic. So as after the Second World War, we need to think about a new world order. There are many dimensions to this future world which require more attention nationally and internationally. And a new commitment to internationalism is vital. That needs to start with dealing with the pandemic. The pandemic was caused by globalization, but also globalization is the only way to overcome it. Not less globalization, more. And particularly more solidarity, more vaccines being sent, not least to South Africa and other developing countries. Vaccine nationalism is the most terrible thing that we're seeing at the moment. It is the antithesis of globalization. It's the mercantilism or the protectionist expression in health of what previously was in some other areas. And it's extremely dangerous. Of course, the vaccines themselves came out of globalization. We would not have a vaccine if it hadn't been for, in Oxford and in Germany, in other places, the biggest international scientific collaboration ever in the most rapid period of time. The sequencing of the genome over 1,000 times within a week after being discovered. The lab up the road from me in Oxford, where the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine was developed, is a model of international collaboration with scientists and research around the world, including, of course, in the trials, including in South Africa, in the phase 2 trials. And the same is true of the Pfizer vaccine, which was built by immigrants from Turkey in Germany for a US company, trialed in many other countries. None of these things would have happened. And yet the vaccine nationalism, which is now present, is preventing the distribution. We need people to walk the talk of solidarity within countries by paying more taxes, by closing offshore tax havens, by ensuring that medicine, that vital goods and service, that technologies for renewable energy and others are shared without intellectual property protection. Now, intellectual property protection is another vital aspect of globalization. But when it comes to life and death, and when it comes to the future of our planet, my view is that we need to recognize that we cannot allow the profits of some to get in the way of the future for all. Of course, firms that invest in technologies deserve a return for their investment. Research and development does not come free. But there are many other ways to do this, including through prizes, through guaranteed purchases of products, and other ways to reward those that innovate, other than locking up the ideas in a safe so no others can share them at the cost of their own lives. The idea of this pandemic leading to a better world is an optimistic one. It's an idea based on an understanding that when you've stood at the edge of the cliff, you recognize that you need to turn around, that going down the same road that you've gone down is not going to lead you to a better future. My nightmare is a return to business as usual. Because it's business as usual. It's the old normal that got us to where we are. It got us to an inevitable pandemic. I've been predicting this every year. It got us inevitably to the financial crisis. It gets us inevitably to rising inequality, to escalating climate change. These things are hardwired into the system we have. And the only way to ensure that we have a better world is to change the underlying things. That's why I also don't like the term the Great Reset or bouncing back. Because a reset implies that you're resetting, like when we reset our computers, you reset an operating system to the system that was already coded into it, that was already there before. Well, if you reset something to what it was, you'll just get back to where you were before the thing crashed. And the same is with the idea of bouncing back or bouncing forward. You're on the same tracks, you're going the same way. We need to change direction. We need to change direction, and we need to change fast. Because unless we do, we're not going to deal with these fundamental problems. Where will the ideas come from? Where is the leadership? There's plenty around. We've seen this in previous experiences, and we see it in the universities. What the faculty, what the students in your university and around the world are recognizing is this need. We've seen amazing solidarity of young people for old. Young people are very unlikely to die of COVID-19. In the UK, where we don't get much lightning, there's more chance of being struck by lightning if you're a teenager than there is of dying by COVID-19. And yet, the schools have been closed, universities, people being told they can't socialize with their friends in order to protect the elderly. And that's right, because the elderly are vulnerable. But that sacrifice must not be in vain. We need to say to the youth, to young people, to students, you're doing this to create a better future for all of us, but particularly for you. We will have jobs, opportunities. We will deal with the big threats the world faces. You will not have to deal with another pandemic or with escalating climate change. That needs to be the payback, like after the Second World War, by creating a better world. And poor countries cannot do this alone. It's a deep embarrassment and scandal that the UK has cut its aid budget by a third at a time when the need has never been greater. And this is happening internationally. We need more solidarity, more vaccines, and more action. And we also need to ensure that we have more good ideas. And so the role of studying, the role of research, the role of students and of teachers at this time is absolutely critical. This is a time of rethinking, of a rebirth, of getting new ideas into new actions. And that demands thinking very deeply about what works, and it's not something that can be global. Because what works in a particular village in South Africa or for the country is going to be very different to what works somewhere else. It requires indigenous, it requires local knowledge, local context, and understanding, going back to Shakespeare, of what the particular tide is, how it's moving, and what the wave is, in order to be able to take advantage of it. My hope is that my few comments have provoked you into some questions, and I now look forward to a conversation with you. I hope you are all in good health. It's a very difficult time, not least a time of isolation and of challenge, and I hope that you get through this and that together we can create a better world. Thank you.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much. And wonderful listening to you, also with your knowledge of our local situation here in South Africa. So linking to the idea of solidarity and local context, Famida asks, your opinion on the role of ensuring solidarity and what can a layperson do to work towards a better outcome. And I think it relates to the whole idea of people power. So, if you want to make a comment on that. So.
I think there are so many levels in which that question, which is absolutely central, can be answered. One is just in our daily lives. Are we looking after our families? Are we looking after ourselves? Unless you are healthy, you can't really look after other people physically and mentally. Um, are we taking care, recognizing the stresses? Uh, are we taking care of those around us that we love? Are we checking in on family and friends, on neighbors, on the community? And it widens, you know, fellow people in your classes, your students, your colleagues. Um, and what together are you doing to try and shape the environment in which you're in, whether it's the towns or villages, or the politics nationally? I think people lead through example, through the way they conduct their lives. But there's no, if you're just a saint on your own
Yeah.
and stick to yourself, you're not going to change the world. Um, it does require interaction with others. And I wouldn't underestimate the power of ideas. I believe there's a battle of ideas that's being waged at the moment. There's some terrible ideas out there, including anti-vaccination movements, for example, fake news, hatred of all types, and corruption. Many bad things are out there. And I think the challenge is not just in what one actually is doing, but also in what one's arguing. And that's why universities and teaching is so important. The student conversations is one's basically thinking through what is the right thing to do in these circumstances. And being passive, being a bystander, is actually allowing things to happen. So action. Now, South Africa, and I'm old enough to have lived through many of the terrible years that your students are fortunate enough not to have been through. But South Africa's been through this many times, and not least in the fight to end apartheid. And the transformation needs to be an inspiration. One of the things I'm struggling to understand is how this experience of the early 90s, the end of apartheid, the birth of democracy, and non-racialism in South Africa is sort of being regarded in rather negative light. And having lived through that, to me, it was a miracle and remains a miracle. But there's a lot to learn still, and I think it's by really digesting the history that one can get the strength to carry on. South Africa's been through some terrible times and struggles before, and come out the other side much better, and I believe it will again.
Thank you, Ian. So you referred to the position of the developing world, within this context. And Tessa asked, what does kind of potential optimism look like for the developing world? Would the developed world be willing to let the big debts go? And would that be enough to get the developing world to pick up and start rolling?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is the most challenging time for development since the Second World War, so in all of our lifetimes. And development's been set off track. There was great optimism when you look at the numbers on many dimensions. Of course, some terrible places and horrible things happening in many countries, but the overall progress was apparent. Of development, and many countries escaping poverty. That's been set back dramatically. And so what does it take to put it back on track? Writing off debt is key, but it's not enough. Firstly, not all countries have debt. Of the 100 or so countries in need, only about 30 really have debt crises. Secondly, if if the cause of the debt crisis is not the pandemic, but mismanagement domestically, or corruption, or other reasons for unsustainable levels of debt, writing off debt is not going to solve the problem. It's going to just lead to possibly even worse levels of corruption and more debt, and a perpetuation of the system. So I'm one of those calling for writing off of debt, but with some caveats about it as to which countries, when, and where. I particularly believe it's necessary for low income countries, and South Africa is not a low income country. One of the big challenges in South Africa, as I often argued with my friends, has not been too little money. It's the ability to spend the money wisely. You know, when I was in government from 94 to 99, we in no single year were we able to adequately spend the money we had. There wasn't the capacity on the ground to spend it wise enough. And so having the capacity to spend money effectively on the things that you need to spend it on is absolutely key, and that requires skills. It requires capacity building on the ground and a commitment of people to work in public service. It also requires a commitment of businesses to invest in their own country, not to send their money overseas or into speculation. So there's a whole package of things for development which are needed. The international dimension and foreign aid is extremely important, as are debt write-offs. But there's only so much the international community can do to create development. Creating peace and security is number one, because conflict is development in reverse. So overcoming conflict is absolutely central. You can't do development when you have conflict. But in a middle-income country like South Africa, the problem, I believe, is not actually going to be solved by international players. The international community has a large part to play. There are many things to be done, not least in getting vaccines to South Africa now. But the basic problem of making the economy move and creating jobs is a domestic problem. That's true of many countries, certainly true of Nigeria, which is, the biggest population in Africa. It's true in Ethiopia, it's true in Kenya, it's true in Tanzania. So I would say, yes, international solidarity, vital, but domestic solidarity and action, more important.
You just mentioned vaccines. There are some fascinating questions here on vaccines. And Andrew Banda from Zambia, and Lere from Nigeria, and Andrew Robinson asking, how would you compare the vaccine nationalism with the vaccine capitalism and the impact on the developing world?
So just what do we mean by vaccine capitalism?
I guess the pharmaceuticals.
Okay, yeah. I think one question is the fact that vaccines are manufactured by private companies the problem? Or is the problem that countries are dominating? So the vaccine I know best is the one that my colleagues have developed in Oxford, which is a collaboration between the university and AstraZeneca. Now, we insisted at the university that firstly, it'd be very cheap. So it's like close to $1 a vaccine compared to $30 for the Pfizer vaccine. And secondly, it's a vaccine, obviously, it doesn't require cold storage, so it can be mobilized for Africa in vast quantities. And thirdly, that it not be curtailed. But the problem is the actual capacity to produce these vaccines. There's just not enough machinery. The factories aren't producing enough. And it's not easy to produce a vaccine. I mean, you can't just, it's not like producing a pen or something. You can't just add another machine. It's a process that takes time. So there is a constraint. And then you get into the question of why aren't there more manufacturing capacities in Africa and elsewhere. And so I think it's both a question of on the private side, it's about the intellectual property. And I think that is less of a problem, because for the Oxford vaccine, for example, and with some of the others, we'll say, here's the formula, you can make it if you want to. We've said that already, but there's nowhere to make it because the manufacturing capacity is owned by the private sector. So one of the takeaways from this pandemic is that we need public investment in capacity, which is standby capacity. Okay. Africa needs a massive vaccine manufacturing capabilities. So do other parts of the world. And that developing that manufacturing capability with clear rules about distribution is important. The COVAX facility is also a great thing, but it doesn't have the money it needs. And also, bizarrely, some countries that are rich are claiming their allocations from it. Yeah. So the constraint at the moment is mainly that there's not enough manufacturing going on. This government in the UK has got most things to do with the pandemic absolutely wrong. But the one thing it's got right is vaccines manufacture, and that's because we have vaccine manufacturing here in abundance. But these are very, very important questions. And my view is that vaccine capitalism is a part of the problem, but the main problem is that we haven't prepared for vaccine manufacturing, and that requires public investment. We cannot expect a private company to have a big vaccine manufacturing capacity that it's not going to use most of the time. These are extremely expensive, sort of hundreds of millions of dollar investments. The only way to make sense of that is through the World Health Organization, through the African Union, through other organizations that do that as a public investment. I think that can be with aid money, sure, but it's not going to be driven by the private sector.
Fascinating. Dwayne Evans, Ian, asks, does this pandemic highlight the need for a universal healthcare system? What's your opinion of the impact this may have on the implementation of the NHI in South Africa?
I think national health systems are vital for many reasons. Hopefully we're not going to have many pandemics, but there are many, many other causes of suffering and ill health. And it's not just in a country like South Africa. The US does not have a national health system. There's over 50 million people in the US that have no access to health. So yes, the question is paying for it. And that depends on what level of coverage it's going to give and what it's going to provide. And the second is the effectiveness of it. And I'm very optimistic that one of the breakthroughs that we're seeing with the pandemic is the ability to deliver better public health at lower cost, not least using new technologies, augmenting capacity, but massive training capacity, massive investment in public health is vital. Now, there's some ground rocks of what makes for healthy societies, and obviously national health system. I would just stress one other thing. I believe that mental health needs to be a vital part of it as well. What often happens with these national health systems is big focus on equipment, on things, on physical health, and mental health is the very poor cousin. What we're seeing in the data is that it's a much bigger hidden pandemic that's happening. And so that needs to, if the pandemic brings mental health out of the shadows, it will also be a very significant form of progress.
And then just in conclusion, Ian, just briefly, your comments on multidisciplinary research. You're the founding director of the Oxford Martin School, this just amazing center at Oxford, looking at the big issues of the 21st century. So multidisciplinary approaches, a word or two.
So I encourage participants to look at the website, Oxford Martin, it's called. .ox.ac.uk. You can also look at my website, Ian Golden, for other stuff related. It's a wonderful thing. It arises because we were very fortunate to get big gifts from James Martin, which is why it's called the Oxford Martin School. And basically, Jim believed that humanity is at the crossroads. This could be the best time ever for humanity, but we could also blow the planet and ourselves up in various ways and increase misery. And the outcome will depend on our ability to bring great ideas together and then move them into action. And that the real world is not going to be defined by disciplines, by silos. That unless we work in interdisciplinary ways, we cannot deal with real world problems. But you need disciplinary expertise and deep disciplinary expertise to be able to add value to the interdisciplinary conversation. And this is an important thing, because a lot of students say, oh, I want to know about everything. Actually, you're not really on top of anything. So be at the forefront of one field and then work with other fields to contribute to overcoming problems. And whether it's poverty, or whether it's the pandemic, or whether it's climate change, whatever, inequality, all of these things occur on multiple dimensions. And so it's about bringing great academics and students together to think through the problems and work together. And one other aspect of this, apart from the Oxford Modern School, I just want to highlight in conclusion, is a new economics curriculum that I've got going called coreecon.org. core-econ.org, which is a new economics curriculum, which is trying to make economics focus on the real world too, to deal with inequality, climate change, etc. Free, open, online website of new curriculum for that. So there's a lot happening, and my hope is that this will be part of the rescue and help create a better world.